to the nutrients so the plants can get at it. Just what she was talking about the nutrients getting siphoned out and everything. That's a big deal around the Arcadia area as well because of the amount of sand we have. When you use the earthworm compost in your soil, it holds the moisture and the nutrients to that. So I just wanted to give you a basic idea before we get it started, why it's important to be composted in the earthworms. Now, what I do is we're going to start off. You're going to need some supplies. Now, the first thing you're going to need is a bin like this, and you put 14 gallons. And sort this out of the way for a minute. Now, the reason why you use a dark bin is earthworms are very sensitive to light. If they see light, they will stop working. So you want it as dark as possible. Now, the main thing that you want to do is make sure it's got moisture, ventilation, and drainage. Those three things can be accomplished by drilling holes in it. Now, what I do is I flip it over. And in these corners, I use a 9/16 spade bit. You can get it right down the street at Ace. And what you do, these plastic bins will pool water in the corners. And you don't want that to happen because if that happens, the bin will become anaerobic and smell very bad and be useless to you. Get this thing going here for a minute. Figured. Use it all day, every day, and when I need it. Anyway, what you do is take the spade bit. You drill the holes in the corners right here. These are to keep, like I mentioned, to keep the water from pooling. Pull this out. The next step is you put this in. This is a 1/4 inch drill. And you see this square in the bottom of them? All of them have it. When they make the mold and they pop it out of the mold, they have this, which is a good pattern for you guys because you can start with your holes right here. Space them about 2 or 3 inches apart. Probably want to get at least 10 or 15 of them in there. And that will allow drainage from the bottom of the worm bin. Now, when you feed your worms, it makes a gas in there. Like a grain elevator will have gas in it and things like that. So you want to make sure that it has holes in the roof of it for this gas to evaporate and get. Now, what I use is, you can use all sorts of things, but don't use metal on your worm bins because you're dealing with water that will rust out in about 2 or 3 weeks. So what I use is cheapest piece of window screen that you can find. 10-foot roll will do a 14-gallon bin. And what I do, again, I use this inside as a pattern, and I cut it out. And I use liquid nails. And when you use liquid nails, I can't stress it enough, you're gonna wanna use gloves, guys, because if you don't, you're going to be peeling part of your skin off too. So, very simple, latex gloves, put them on, use them when you're doing liquid nails. You don't use silicone because the earthworms eat the silicone. Trust me on that one. And if you do that, they will escape. And the main thing is, earthworms will travel during the phase of the moon. Usually the first full moon, they will travel. And to keep them from traveling, this is why you keep them contained. By the way, this bin right here will hold 5,000 worms.
Wow.
Okay? This bin right here, every 3 weeks, will produce enough earthworm castings for you guys to do a 1/4 acre of land every 3 weeks. Now, the interesting thing I want to touch on about the product that comes out of here is the earthworm castings, like I mentioned. You only have to put it down 3 times a week, 3 times a year. It goes for a 120-day release. So what I like is if I'm putting my okra in and I'm sowing my seeds, I can broadcast over the top of it, of the raised beds or whatever you have, water it in, and your bed will be prepped, and it'll have the nutrients that it can draw on for the entire growing season. So you get about twice the harvest because the plant isn't looking for the nutrients, it's right there, so it can just make it withdraw, so to speak. Now, you can use all sorts of different compost, but what works good, the main thing you want to avoid is your compost packing down so tight that the earthworms won't go in there and they lay on the top and die. What I use sphagnum peat moss. You can get it right down there, like I mentioned at Ace. You want to probably get Canadian peat because that is more organic and you won't have a lot of the chemicals in it that American peat will have. You break that up, it was shredded paper. Now what I use also, which isn't here, but it's a three-pronged garden tool. You can get it at any garden store, you know, the short garden tools. You water it in, you water your bedding in. You want the bedding to be about halfway up because you're going to be adding compost and other things. So you turn it, and you turn it, and you turn it until there's no dry spots. Because if a worm hits a dry spot, he's going to die in about a minute and a half or so. So the main thing is keep it damp, not underwater. You want to keep it damp, like a damp sponge or what have you. That's the consistency. Now, how you feed your worms is important, and I'll tell you why. There's one thing that worms produce. They produce an amino acid. And when they produce that, they need to get away from it. So they can't, nothing can live in its own excrement for very long. Let's put it that way. So what I do is there's things that you can feed the worms and things that you should not feed the worms, and I'll tell you why. One, if you're going to feed the worms citrus, you want to make sure they're all fully grown and there's no babies in there, because the citric acid will burn the baby worms. It's just like their skin is not quite developed. So you want to be careful with that. If you do it, mix it very well. You can use anything that comes, kitchen scraps, anything like that. One exception, I've heard good and bad things about it, so I'm just going to touch on it real quick, guys, is avocado peelings, not the meat itself, but the peelings have an oil that may or may not, the jury's still out on this, may or may not cause you a problem in the bin, so I just avoid the peeling altogether just to save you a headache. Now, what I recommend, a worm is like a vacuum. It sucks things up and grinds them up like a chicken does with a gizzard. So that's what makes them very good at composting. So they eat their weight every day, by the way, guys. So if you have a pound of worms, they'll eat a pound of whatever you put in there. Now what I use as a base is cornmeal. Now cornmeal is called masa. There's two types of cornmeal. The yellow cornmeal you don't want because it's not organic and it'll put a lot of bad things in there. And if you want to stay organic, which I assume most of you guys want to do that, I use the white unrefined cornmeal tortilla mix. It's called masa. It's got a guy that looks like a piece of corn. You can get it right at Walmart. Get a little bag and just set it. And what I do is I use that as a base. Mix that up and mix whatever else you have in there. You know, after you run your after you eat your vegetables or whatever, run it through the food processor. You make a little slurry out of it, and you mix it in there with the masa that I was talking about. It's kind of like a little slurry, and you make about a 2-inch strip down the middle. And this is good because the worms will come up, and they will come up to eat, and they will go down to eat. So they work your bin like this, up and down like this. They'll also work it from side to side because if you put that strip, they'll come from the sides as well. So you get more quality, higher quality castings, and more of it. Now, there are several different species of worms that you can use to compost with. One that you will get online, which is questionable if you can even use them down here in the summertime, are the red wigglers. Now, red wigglers slow down, if not stop, their producing of castings when the temperature reaches about 80 degrees. And it's 80 degrees most of the time down here. So what I would suggest is getting something that is called a garden mix. It has the super reds, which is a tropical version of the red worms, and the African Nightcrawler, which was developed by USF back in the 70s for orange production. They're specifically designed for this environment. They're getting a little scarce, but you can get them in a mix. And it's called the garden mix. Now, one of the good companies that I've relied on for at least probably 12 years or so is called Best Buy Worms. And Mike and Dee Ball, they're great people. They taught me, so that's a reliable source. Some of these guys, you won't even get them alive. Like if you get them from, I don't want to use any names, but if you get them from certain companies online, there is a 50% chance that the worms will not even arrive alive for you guys. And nothing smells quite as aroming as a dead worm. It's got a certain smell. But by the way, this is what's nice. These earthworms will produce castings every 3 weeks, every 21 days, like I mentioned, guys. And I'm going to go and talk to you about another type of worm that they use for composting. And I don't know why they do this, but they do. There is a worm. This is why we have voicemail. Excuse me. But there's a worm that's called the blue worm. It's a very pretty worm. It looks like turquoise, and they think that, and they're from Hawaii. The only problem is they're called the traveling worm because, like I mentioned, during the full moon, they'll get up and leave, but they won't bring their friends back. I don't know, so you know, they just get up and leave. So you don't want that. They produce a good casting, but they don't stay around long enough to do it. So that's a headache waiting to happen. So you don't want to do that. There is also the European Nightcrawler, which is basically used for fishing because you will be basically waiting the rest of your life to have any castings out of them. So probably every 180 days for them. So the African Nightcrawler is a bigger worm, and ladies, do not be scared because they cannot hurt you. They do not have the mouths equipped to do that. And they get about as big as the palm of your hand, and and what you can do with them, you can recognize them because they got a purple top. They kind of got a purple sheen on them. And what you can do, and the bigger they are, the higher quality castings they produce because the material spends more time inside the earthworm, like we mentioned, breaking down, going through the gizzards and stuff, and you have nutrients in your gut, so do they. That's what makes it good. And the earthworm does all the work so the plant doesn't have to. And the one thing, and I still deal with it to this day to a certain degree, one problem you're going to have is fire ants. Now, fire ants will come with a source of water. They can smell water. They'll harvest the baby worms, but not the adults. And they'll keep harvesting them and bringing them back, and you'll never have any more worms in the bin, and you can't figure out why. Solution to that is if you're doing this outside, which I suggest you do under an oak tree, under shade, at least 6 hours of shade, because you don't want the bin to get too hot. And you water your bin, like I say, when it loses that sponge-like consistency, and you can tell when the bin's ready to work, because it looks like the ground's been worked and turned over by the earthworms. If that whole top looks like that, they're ready to be sifted. Now, when you sift your earthworms, you know those screens that you use when you guys look for fossils and stuff, you know, that type of screen, you can build it out of one by one, so you can put it together real easy. It's called hardware cloth. Instead of using the quarter inch hardware cloth, I recommend the 1/8 inch hardware cloth because you're not losing your babies and your eggs. And it'll give you a higher quality castings and all that garbage. See, the garbage is never wasted. Nothing's wasted. It goes right back into the bin. And it'll smell like home, so they won't want to travel as much. You know, they'll say, oh, that smells like home. I'm not going, don't have to worry about it. But the nice thing about the African Nightcrawlers is they can take temperature. If it gets 100 degrees, it's not going to bother them. If it gets 120 degrees, it's not going to bother them. So you can put them, you have a flexibility with these worms. You can put them in those rolling composters and things like that, where it gets really hot and goes through the heat. The worms will go through the heat as well. So that's the flexibility of the African Nightcrawler that you wouldn't have with any other worm. And, by the way, they are one of the few worms that can actually process the silica in the sand and turn it into another element. So that's kind of interesting. All the other worms are not designed for the sand, basically. Now, what's interesting about this is worms live about 10 years in captivity if you take care of them. They live about 2 years in the wild because everything eats them. They are very essential for every living thing, including us. If there were no, if you take a look outside and you see every grain of sand out there, it was inside a worm at one time or another. So that gives you an idea. This place would look like the moon if it was not for the earthworm. I think I covered everything. If I did,